All right, we're multitasking. So, okay, so at this point, we should be through, really, you should be into chapter 5. So if everybody is there, you're right on target. And chapter 5 is kind of the first chapter where we start getting into some meat and potatoes of the class.
Yeah.
So again, the whole purpose of these sessions is to address any concerns you had. So Gary, you had said you had a couple of questions from what you were studying this week.
Yes, and it got to where I was doing the chapter 5 review quiz. And there were 2 questions having to do with junction boxes versus combiner boxes.
Uh-huh.
And the ideas of series or parallel wiring into those. And I got to those and realized I didn't really know the answer to it. No, so I started trying to find it back in the book, and I haven't quite found that yet. So I thought it might be quicker for you to.
Sure. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit of the history of how these solar systems evolved. In the early days, what they would do is they would take the strings from the panels, and you hook them up in strings to get them up to a certain level, certain voltage. So as a string, by definition, is a series connection. And so you take your strings together, and then you would come into the combiner box. The combiner box was really the first stage of this. And the reason for it is in the combiner box, then you could make parallel connections. So in a combiner box, you're going to connect the positive with the positive with the positive with the positive, depending on how many they are. If there's only 2 strings, it's really could just be a wire nut, I mean, that would be a parallel connection. Now, the more that you connect together in parallel in a combiner box, the greater the ampacity of the wire that's leaving. And it was really something about, okay, if I'm coming into the combiner box with 6 sets of wire, 6 positives and 6 negatives from 6 strings of panels, it's cheaper if I leave with 1 set of bigger wire. So I'm making my parallel connections in the combiner box and then leaving with a bigger gauge wire, as opposed to leaving with 6 sets of smaller gauge wire. It was just economics. But the thing we ran into is once you make those parallel connections, now the maximum PowerPoint tracking device that's keeping those panels at their optimal level. You remember what the MPPT is designed to keep that on the IV curve, to keep the panel operating at the sweet spot, at the maximum PowerPoint spot. Well, one of the advantages of a power optimizer or a microinverter is that every panel operates independently of every other panel. So each panel is operating at that sweet spot. The MPPT is located at the panel. If I hook them up in a string, then the entire string operates at the same MPPT. So one panel may be drawing down. So you're getting kind of the blended average. So you're not going to get the best. You're going to get the best of the average. Well, if I hook those strings together, now my whole array is going to operate at the same MPPT. So I probably reduced my production by at least 5%. Because if I've got a panel that's operating, plus or minus 5%, which is kind of the range that these panels do operate. Some work a little better, some work a little less. If I hook them together, it's minus 5%. It always operates at the lowest common denominator. So if I hook the whole string together, then I've reduced everything down to the lowest common denominator. So then what the inverter company started doing is saying, you know what, instead of just having one MPPT at the inverter, we're going to have multiple MPPTs so I could run multiple strings to the inverter.
Oh, okay.
So at that point, we no longer wanted to use a combiner box. We wanted to use a junction box where it's just a wire transition, but then we run multiple strings down to the inverter. And it's simply because the value of the energy produced outweighs the cost of the additional wire. So it became just an economic decision that having multiple strings running down to the inverter was a better decision.
Okay.
So in today's market, we almost always use junction boxes and not combiner boxes.
And those are, oh, okay. I see.
Yeah, a junction box is nothing more than just a transition point. Because when you come off of the array, you're usually coming off with that big, heavy PV wire, the same stuff that's connected to the panels themselves.
Yeah.
But you don't want to run 100 feet of that through a conduit because it's expensive. So you go to a junction box and then you transition to a lesser cost cable, like a THHN or a THWN wire, and you transition. So the junction box is just a transition point, but a combiner box is the same thing, but then you combine the strings in parallel.
Okay. So the strings coming together are coming together at the same voltage.
Yes,
No, the
they have
voltage
to.
would go up.
No, if you're combining them in parallel, the
No,
voltage remains the same.
I mean, you were saying that in a junction box, they're in series.
Yeah, the series come in, but they don't get connected to any other string. You're just going from one type of wire to another type of wire.
Oh, okay.
So that voltage remains the same as it passes through those wires. You're not making a connection between the two, either series or parallel. You're just making a transition for the wire. The thing with the junction, with the combiner box though, is if I'm going to hook those strings together in parallel, then the voltage of each of those strings has to be identical. They have to be, the strings have to be uniform.
Okay.
Otherwise you get into some problems.
Yeah.
You get things that are imbalanced. So that also led to the fact that in your design, if you're coming in with multiple strings, you have to make sure each one of them is identical. So that limits some of your design options, because if I come in with 3 strings of 8, well, I want to add one more panel. I can't come in with 2 strings of 8 and 1 of 9. I've got to come in with 3 strings of 9 or 3 strings of 8.
Got it.
And those are my options. But if I'm treating them independently of each other, then typically they can be independent of each other. They can be of different sizes. So the thing that Solar Edge does is when you're hooking together a string, those optimizers actually set the voltage at a fixed voltage. I'm going to put.
I get that now. Now I thought just optimizers were just trying to take care of shading light, but they're also trying to fix the voltage so they're all the same.
Yeah, they keep the voltage the same. And then the more that you add into that string, it increases the amps, but the volts remain the same. And that does a couple of things. It allows you to operate at different length strings, but it also then keeps the inverter simpler, because, the Solar Edge string inverter, most string inverters have to operate within a range of voltage. They have like a startup voltage of 100 volts and a maximum of 600. But a Solar Edge inverter comes in and it says, we operate at 400 volts.
That's it.
Yeah. So we don't have to have all that other equipment. So I can keep the price down of my string inverter because it's just a simpler thing. And oh, by the way, because we're using optimizers, we don't have to have rapid shutdown in this inverter because it's up at the optimizer. We don't have to have an MPPT because it's up at the optimizer. We don't have to have communication devices there because it's at the optimizer. So you're taking some of the functionality of a string inverter and putting it at the panel. And then you're making, so typically a string inverter might cost you, say, $2,500, but the Solar Edge string inverter might be $1,600. so the cost of that unit is less because they've made it a little bit simpler because they pushed a bunch of the functionality up to the panel.
And you needed the optimizers anyway, just to meet code for shutdown.
Yeah, the rapid shutdown. Now, once rapid shutdown came into play, we kind of didn't have a choice of using a traditional string inverter, but now a company called Tigo, they manufacture rapid shutdown power electronics for multiple different types of string inverters. So you could buy a Fronius or some other manufacturer, a Sunny Boy, and you can buy Tigo module level power electronics that are compatible with it and put your rapid shutdown up there on the on the panel. So you could use a string inverter and still meet that rapid shutdown provision. So it's effectively, if you look at module level power electronics, the ultimate one is the microinverter. It does everything at the panel. The power optimizer does everything except converting DC to AC. But Tigo also has one that will do, it'll have a communication device and a rapid shutdown, or just a rapid shutdown, or the MPPT control, which basically means it's a power optimizer. So it does 3 or 2 or 1 of these functions at the module. So there's a lot of flexibility. So, but essentially in the world today, rapid shutdown says if that panel is on a building, it's got to have some power electronic attached to the panel, to protect it for rapid shutdown. Any other?
Well, just as part of that, if you had a ground mount system that was some distance from your house, you wouldn't have to have the rapid shutdown at the panel, right? But it seems to me you'd still want to have some way to quickly kill the power from the panels back.
Yeah, for a ground mounted system, they do not fall under the rapid shutdown provision of the NEC. So it's not critical that you have it. But as you say, you may want to be able to shut it down. So normally you would put a DC disconnect right there on the array so that you could just pull a lever and the whole system shuts down. So oftentimes you'll have a DC disconnect at the array and then one at the house or wherever at the inverter. And you may also want to have power electronics so that you can maximize the output from each panel. And more, it's important that there be some sort of communication device that allows you to see what each panel is producing, how it's producing, how it's doing. Is there a problem with that panel? If you don't have it at the panel level, then you can only be monitoring at the string level. So it'll say this string is working, but you don't know if it's really working or how well it's working. Give an example. We were just doing some troubleshooting on a place over here in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and it has like 6 strings, but the whole system seems to be producing less than it should, but it's kind of vague because there's not really good monitoring. So we're looking at each of the string inverters going, well, how much do you think it should be producing right now? But that's subject to weather conditions and things like that. So we're kind of going, well, it's producing 4 kW, but I think it maybe should be producing more. But how do we measure that? How do we know that? How do we, without actually having good individual panel production, to monitor?
Probably worth the money to put the same kind of equipment in that you would if it was a roof mount.
Yeah, I think so. And the costs are not that much for those electronics anymore. Some of them are only $29 a piece, $39 a piece. So, but if you've got a 10,000 panel utility scale system, well, $39 a piece adds up,
Sure.
and unless you're getting real world data that you need,
Yeah.
why spend, $390,000 that you don't need to spend?
Yeah.
So,
Of course, the other side of that is, okay, I have that many panels out there that now I have no way of knowing anything about them at all.
right, right.
That
Uh-huh.
many panels. Yeah.
Yep. No, I would
Flip
be on
side.
your side. But I'm
Yeah.
always amazed when you talk about commercial systems, either solar or just building a building, how these people can be so penny wise and pound foolish. It's
Yeah.
like
Sure.
let's chintz on everything,
Yeah.
and then you end up with a chintzy building. So
Yeah. MBAs.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yep. Craig, did you have any questions from this week's reading?
Uh, I did. I apologize. I don't know. Can you see me? Because I have nothing but a blank here, and I
Yeah,
don't know why.
we've just got a blank, but I can hear you now.
Okay. All right. Great. Now I apologize for being late. Um, One of the test questions involved the ISC string calculations, and was that in a different chapter? Because for some reason I couldn't find it and answer appropriately, until I got it wrong. But
Okay.
uh, was there a location regarding that particular question in chapter 5, or was that earlier thing that I just forgot?
Okay. Do you know which question number you're talking about?
Hold, well, it was part of the quizzes along the way,
Right. Oh,
and
okay.
and it involved the string calculation. It was like 3 or 4 questions regarding that, and it was it threw me off because I could not find that how to calculate that to ensure that I got the right percentage. It was like uh, that particular ISC number, IMP number multiplied by 1.25 times 1.25 again, I believe.
Uh-huh.
So
Okay. Yeah.
Oh,
That's
yeah, I had that too.
okay.
Yeah.
Let me see here. Let me
Couldn't find this solar 1.25
right.
oh,
adjustment input.
the solar variable.
Yeah, the solar variable. I couldn't find that anywhere.
Yeah, let me see. I mean, again, that's just something that's in my brain as far
Right.
as so I don't know. Let me see if I can look it up. I'm trying to think it's um solar variability factor. See in the index solar constant. I see the NEC. I'll look for the NEC adjustment. I don't know that I would have put that in the NEC. Would have been when we're sizing.
It was dealing with the ampacity and the
Yeah,
ampacity table location in lab, that particular one. Um, and let me see.
It was sizing wire.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. I'm just trying to think where that does that come into effect. Well, that's for resistance in chapter 4. Do we get into wire ampacity in chapter 5 for the first time?
Yes, if I'm
Okay.
not mistaken. Yes,
All
because
right.
that's where it is involved the conduits, the 7/8 cents above. Just calculating all the various reduction or increase of the wiring uh, on the roof or where it's located. And but it came upon that particular question dealing with uh, the calculating the appropriate amperage using the ampacity table
Yeah,
And I
there we
just didn't
are.
know that formula was and stuff, and calculating which particular AUG wire to use.
Yeah, wiring the system. I show on page 103. That looks like that's where it.
Yeah.
Yeah, wires and conduit design. Just trying to, what I'm trying to find here is I can explain it to you, of course, but I
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
make sure that to see if I can find the specific reference to where that comes into play. Let me show you let me jump into the whiteboard here.
I didn't find where the NEC fudge factor of 25% was discussed either. I knew that one, but
Yeah. It's it may be, that's worth me looking into, because I'm afraid it's got to be in that very beginning section. I don't want to spend all the time looking for it, but let me make a note to look up.
That's okay.
I want to make sure it comes in the right order. NEC and solar variability. All right, so if I'm going to go into presenting, open up the whiteboard. Here, grab my little whiteboard. Okay. Can you guys see
yes.
the whiteboard here?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Let me see where I can. How do I clean that? This is a weird one. All right. It's not really the whiteboard I'm used to. This is the, all right. So is that doesn't show up over there. Trying to see where there's an eraser where I can get rid of here. All right. Did that get bigger on your screen?
I mean, it's taking up my whole screen.
Okay, good.
And you're
to
the left, upper left corner of your board.
Okay, so here where if I say this is the array, and typically what we run into, let's say that we've got 3 strings coming into a combiner box. So this is the combiner box here.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So then this would be just an old-fashioned string inverter system. So I'm going to go to a DC disconnect here. And then from that DC disconnect, going to go to an inverter. Then from the inverter, I'd go to an AC disconnect. And then from that AC disconnect, I would come into my service panel. And then that would go out to the electric meter. Okay. Can you see all of that stuff normally?
Yeah.
Yes.
So what we would do typically, the first electronic device is this inverter in this old-fashioned system. So we would take the ISC. So let's say we look at the solar panel, and the ISC for a single panel is, let's say, 9.38 amps. And that's the ISC. Well, you remember that by definition, a string is a series connection. And when you hook things together in series, the voltage goes up, but the amps remain the same. So the amps for a string is going to be the same as the amps for a single panel. Because it's a series connection, the amps don't change. Okay. So I could hook up 2 panels, I could hook up 20 panels. It's still going to be 9.38 amps. No difference. Okay. So I want to reemphasize that, because if you don't get that, you're going to be in trouble. Okay. All right. So then the NEC in all aspects of wiring says, in order to be safe in sizing the wire, we want you to take whatever the maximum amperages are and multiply it times 1.25. And that's going to be your NEC safety margin. So in AC electricity and DC electricity and solar, if you're wiring an outlet, you're going to take the amps and you're going to multiply it times 1.25. And you better make sure the wire can handle that much, because they don't want you sizing wire just right up to the limit. They want there to be a bit of a fudge factor. So they just say, okay, 1.25. So that's the normal NEC, any electrician, they're just going to be aware of that. Okay.
Okay.
You guys with me so far?
Yep.
Yes,
So,
sir.
so in this case, in all situations, I'm going to go into my calculator here. We would end up with, in this example, 9.38 times 1.25. So it's 11.725. So when I'm sizing wire, I better make sure I've got wire that can handle at least 11.725. But in the world of solar, we have what's referred to the solar variability factor. And the reason for that is that 9.38 was developed based on standard test conditions, which says that a radiance is 1,000 watts per square meter. But in the real world, it can be significantly more on some occasions. In fact, I've had measurements where I've gotten 1,200 watts per square meter measurements with a tool, with a radiance meter. So just to be safe, because solar varies, we're going to multiply it times a second 1.25. And that's the solar variability. So now I take my 11.725 times 1.25, and we get 14.65.
Okay.
All right. But now, why didn't we just multiply it? If you take 1.25 times 1.25, you can get, I think it's 1.52. We could have said, all right, multiply it times 1.52, but that would confuse all of the electricians who are used to doing it once. And now we're just saying, do it a second time. You know, it's just easier to understand.
Okay.
You know, you do it once because the NEC says to do it. Now for solar, do it a second time. So now that wire has to be rated to handle 14.65 amps minimum. Can be more, but that's the minimum. Now, so each of these wires here has to be 14.65 amp rated. Now, it turns out that in today's world, given the size of solar panels and given the way they're developed, pretty much 12 gauge is going to cover any of those situations. So 12 gauge wire will handle up to 25 amps. So most all solar panels come already pre-wired with 12 gauge wire. It's because the typical solar panel, given its size and its voltage, is going to be in the 9 to 10 amp range for an ISC. So you're never going to get more than about 15 amps. So 12 gauge wire is going to cover you in all situations.
Okay.
And so you could then pretty much count that your jumpers from the panel to that combiner box are always going to be 12 gauge. You know, you could go with a bigger wire, but it's unnecessary to jump it to that combiner box. But once we hit the
11.25.
Pardon?
I see that my panels are 11.25 amps.
Oh, 11.25. Okay. Well, if we run it 1.25 times 1.25, you're still only going to be 16, 17, and you're still well under the 25. Okay. So now in the combiner box, we're making a parallel connection. So with a parallel connection, amps go up, but the voltage remains the same. So we would take this modified amperage times 3 in this example, and we would end up with 43.96, or basically 44 amps.
Yeah.
So now we need wire in the PV output circuit, leaving the combiner box, that can handle 44 amps. So if I look up on my table here, and the table that's on page 104, the ampacity table.
We're at a 6.
So we would need 44 amps. So it's going to have to be 6 gauge minimum, right? Because 8 gauge only handles 40.
Yeah.
And the trick there is only read from the first column. It doesn't matter which kind of wire you're using. Get your ampacity from the first column only. This is not something that's a rule from the NEC, but I'm just telling you from a good design standpoint, only read from the first column. And the reason for that is the ampacity rating is not just for the wire, but it's also for the connection point in the combiner box in this example, and it's the connection terminal in the DC disconnect. So each of those lugs, each of those points of contact has its own ampacity rating. And it is, it may be rated for 60 degrees centigrade or 75 degrees centigrade or 90 degrees centigrade. But unless you've already bought the equipment, you don't know what it's going to be. Is it going to be low temperature, medium temperature, high temperature rating? So just assume it's the worst case. Just assume you're only, because if I'm using high temperature wire, if you look in the column there on page 104, and I look over into column 3 there, and I say, well, shoot, you know what? 6 or 8 gauge wire, it's rated for 55 amps if it's high temperature wire. So why can't I use 8 gauge wire? Well, you could, except that the terminals that you're connecting to might only be rated for 60 degrees Celsius. So the wire's okay, but the terminations are not. So just make sure, just read from the first column. You know, you'll save yourself a lot of heartache. And you end up sometimes putting wire in that's one size too big. Well, okay. So you did, you know,
Right.
That's fine. It costs you a little bit of money. But you never get yourself in trouble putting wire that's too big. I shouldn't say never. Sometimes it's hard to pull. Sometimes it's hard to terminate. But from a functionality standpoint, it's not going to cause you any problem. But if you put in wire that's too small, well, your system may catch on fire, you know, it may stop working, it'll, you know, it'll cause you a whole lot of hurt. And if you think you're going to expand the system in the future, well, then put in bigger wire. You know, it's a lot cheaper to do it now than it is to do it in the future. So what I would recommend you do, let's say that you're putting this array on this rooftop. So I just draw the roof here, and that's the space of the rooftop. And this is the size of your array. Well, I would design the system to fill up the whole roof, even though you're not installing it now, and figure out what that capacity is if you filled up the whole roof, and then put wire in to meet that capacity.
There you go.
You know, because you may be sitting here today going, well, there's no way I'm going to be doubling the size of my array. I mean, my kids are moving out. You know, we have pretty modest means or whatever. And then all of a sudden, you know, you decide I'm buying an electric vehicle, and oh, by the way, our gas furnace stopped working, so I'm converting over to an electric heat. And, you know, and before you know it, it's like, hey, I'd like to fill up that roof. So why not design the wire for the full amount?
You sell the house, and the next owner doesn't have any idea what the size of the wire is, and they double the array. And
yeah, well, that's
right,
true.
right, yeah.
But that's kind of not your problem.
You got the check already, so you good.
Nice guy.
If they didn't check the damn wire size. So yeah, but it's just good. It's good practice because, you know, if you've installed one of these systems, the wire is such a small part of the overall cost. And really the labor of pulling the wire and making all your terminations and everything is really where the cost is going to be involved. So you may as well just future proof it, to the maximum capacity. That's
Right.
just good design practice. So does this make sense then why we're doing the times 1.25 times 1.25?
Does.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
we did 44 amps now at the combiner box.
Yeah.
And so we haven't adjusted for temperature or anything.
No,
So
we
we
didn't
would do
adjust
that
for,
too.
yeah, we would have to look at it. Well, because of the combiner box, we're only leaving with 2 wires. So we don't have to worry about conduit fill because there's only 2 wires in there. And the conduit fill is typically if there's 4, 6, 8 wires, whatever. But if this conduit is exposed to sunlight and it's lying on the deck of the roof, then we're going to have to make some adjustment there. The other thing that we're going to have to make an adjustment for is it depends on the distance. And this is very common. Let's say we're up on the roof here and the distance between this combiner box and this inverter, let's just say it's 150 feet.
Yeah.
Well, now you got to worry about voltage drop.
Right.
Pretty much anything over 100 feet, you better factor in voltage drop, because anything less than 100 feet, the ampacity rating is probably going to cover your voltage drop. Maybe not necessarily, but it probably 99 times out of 100, you're going to be okay if it's a short distance. But now, okay, well, what's the voltage drop equation? That's voltage drop equals amps times resistance, right? Times twice the distance over 1,000 feet.
1,000. Yeah.
All right. So we know it's 150 feet. So it's going to be 300 over 1,000. Well, that's going to be 0.3. We know the ampacity. The ampacity here is the actual ampacity, not the adjusted ampacity. So, and in this case, this was the ISC. Well, that's the worst case scenario ampacity. So I would want to look at what is the IMP, not the ISC. What's the actual amps, not the worst case amps. So I would look at my thing, and if 9.38 is the ISC, it's going to be, let's say 8.95. It'll be a little bit less.
Yeah.
So I'm just making up some numbers. So in this case, it would be 8.95 times 3, because we multiplied it. We're still combining it. So it'd be 8.95 times 3 strings. So in this case, it's going to be 8.95 times 3, 26.85. So look at the difference here. This is the actual amps I anticipate going over the wire, but this is the amount we have to design the wire for just to make sure we're transporting 26.85 amps. So there's a lot of safety factor in these designs. So now I'm going to take this. My amps over here is going to be 26.85. And now where do I get my resistance? I get it out of the NEC. And in our book, we've reproduced that. I need to find where that table is. I saw it a little bit earlier here. Do you remember where the resistance table is?
Looking for it.
Look it up.
85, page 84.
Yeah, resistance, page 84. Page 84 and 85 there. All right, so page 84. So if I had decided I'm using, we said we're going to use 6-gauge wire, right?
Yeah.
So number 6-gauge wire has a resistance of 0.491, right?
Yeah.
Times 0.491 ohms. So now if I take 26.85 times 0.491 times 0.3 equals 3.95. Did you guys get the same thing? Wait for you to catch up there. Let me double check it. 26.85 times 0.491 times 0.3. 3.95.
Yep, 3.95, 3.96.
Yeah. So it's 3.95 or 3.96 volts. That's how much voltage is going to be lost going from the combiner box to the DC disconnect. Well, what you really should do is the same calculation then from the DC disconnect to the inverter. But usually the DC disconnect is built into the inverter. So it's usually from the junction box to your DC disconnect, or from the combiner box to that's going to be your longest distance.
Mhm.
All right. So in this case, we're losing 3.95 volts. All right. Is that acceptable? Well, if this system is, let's just, I was going to say, if it's operating at 400 volts and we're losing 3.95, well, then that's going to be about 1%.
Yeah.
Right? That's acceptable. We want to keep our voltage drop below 2%.
Mhm.
So no worries. We're going to be fine. But if we had decided we were using, let's say, 8-gauge wire, we're probably still going to be fine. Let me extend that distance. Let's say instead of 150 feet, we're going 450 feet. Okay, so now instead of 0.3, this is going to be 0.9. Well, then we go 26.85 times 0.491 times 0.9. Now we're losing almost 12 volts. Well, 12 volts, I show 11.86 volts, divided by 400, now we're losing 3%.
Yeah.
Well, we want to try and keep it below 2%. So what's our choice? Our choice is shorten the distance. Well, we should have shortened the distance if we could have anyway. So it may be that this is just what it is, or put in bigger wire. So how would we put in bigger wire? We put in bigger wire. Well, if we put in, we were talking about 6-gauge. Well, let's put in 4-gauge. If we put in 4-gauge, I can see times 0.308. That's going to give us 0.308, 26.85 times 0.308 times 0.9, 7.44. So yeah, that got us under 2%, just barely. So in this case, because it's that distance, I would probably not use 6-gauge. I would use 4-gauge, just because of voltage drop.
Got it.
All right.
Okay.
Yep.
The
Yeah.
ampacity is still cool, but the voltage drop is the issue
Right.
there.
So the voltage at the combiner box going into the combiner box would be the same. But coming out of that combiner box, the voltage went up. No, the opposite.
No, well, yeah, the voltage is coming in at the same, and yeah, through the whole system, the voltage should remain the same. In that case, let's say whatever each of those strings are here, whatever the voltage is here, here, and here, it's going to be the same voltage here. because we made a parallel connection, the amps went up, but the voltage remained the same.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah. Although the issue is we leave the combiner box. Let's say we're leaving the combiner box at 400 volts. We arrive down here. Even with the number 4 wire, we're going to arrive down here at about 392 volts. That's the whole idea of voltage drop.
Yeah.
You know, so that's
there would have to be an adjustment at some point before you get to the panel to get it back at 240 volts, wouldn't it?
well, what happens here is it comes into the inverter at 392. It leaves the inverter at 240 volts AC.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're making so now, okay, the voltage is leaving the inverter at 240 volts. We got to redesign our wire at this point because everything has changed.
Right.
All of that other information that we had before. So how would we design this next section of wire here? How would we figure that out? Well, what we do is we say, okay, what is the size of the inverter?
Right.
So let's just say this is a 4 kW inverter, 4,000 watts. 4,000 watts divided by 40 volts.
Yeah.
Gives us how many amps?
240 or 40?
240.
Okay.
Call it 17 amps.
16.66.
Yeah.
Right? Or 6.7 amps. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. But now the NEC says 16.67 times 2 or times 1.25. Sorry.
So that's 20, a little over 20 amps.
A little over 20 point something.
20.8.
20.8 amps. So we look at our table and what size wire do we need? Well, we could go with 12 gauge, right? That's 25 amp.
Yeah.
Right.
But what's one of my rules of thumb in solar design is never use anything smaller than 10 gauge.
Yep.
So use 10 gauge.
10 gauge.
Yeah, because my rule of thumb with that is, once again, you never get in trouble using bigger wire, but there are some specific rules and little caveats and asterisks if you're using something 12 gauge or below. So you can avoid all of those caveats and things to remember if you just say, I'm never using wire less than 10 gauge, and then you're going to be okay. And the difference in cost between 10 gauge and 12 gauge, pretty minuscule, you know. So why not use 10 gauge? Just put that in your brain that when I'm wiring, in fact, if I were wiring my house from scratch today, I would use 10 gauge wire. I wouldn't use 12 gauge, even though a lot of people even use 14 gauge. Well, that just to me is like asking for trouble. You know, so you spent over the course of your house an extra $600 or $700. Well, your house costs more than $600 or $700, you know, so so why not have the wiring system? And you never know when you're going to want to upgrade something. You know, we're moving towards all electric kind of stuff, so it'd be nice to have bigger wire where you swap out some of those 15 amp breakers for some 20 amp or 25 or even 30 amp breakers while the wire's in place to do it. So may as well. So that's kind of where I'm at there.
I noticed the breaker in my panel for my PV is a 20 amp breaker. And so I couldn't handle more than 16 amps.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because what's one of the typical sizes of an inverter? Typical inverter size is 3.8 kW.
Okay.
Or a 7.6 kW. Well, when it all works out, 3.8 is going to be 16 amps.
Yeah,
And then times 1.25 is going to be 20 amps.
right.
7.6, that's going to be 40 amps.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why those inverters are such weird sizes.
Okay.
Is 3.8. It seems like it should be a 4 kW inverter, but it's not. It's 3.8. Well, why? It's because of that.
Yeah.
Also, you get into the 120% rule, but I don't think we're there yet in the book about service panels. But
No, I happen to know that, but yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so 3.8 kW, you're going to be dealing with 20 amp wire, you know, because that's just the output once it's factored. So
Okay.
seem like that's a long explanation for something nobody asked about, but
Actually, I was asking,
That's
that's what I
good.
was asking about.
That's good.
Yeah.
there's
And I
this-
ran into these questions. In reading your book, I realized, oh, wait a minute, I had these questions when my solar was being installed and I didn't realize these were my questions. I knew something was bothering me about the whole thing. And this was it.
oh,
Good.
this thing, you know what? On these whiteboards, on my other whiteboard thing, there's like an eraser. And I don't see the eraser here anywhere. How does that work? It feels like we should. I can just jump to a different page, but then that's all right. So any other questions here in the wide world of solar?
That did it for me for this week.
Okay.
Yeah, same here. That's the only thing that tripped me up was dealing with the 1.25 factor that somehow I didn't catch.
Yeah, and the other thing to bear in mind is once you put a module level electronic device on your panel, you've now
Yeah.
eliminated the variability of solar.
Of needing that, yeah.
So at that point, you don't have to worry about that second 1.25. So if I've got an optimizer or a microinverter up there or anything with like the MPPT tracking device up on my panel, just ignore that second 1.25 because the electronics is going to modulate that. It's going to take care of it. So really, you're only multiplying that second 1.25 factor until you get to the first piece of electronics in the system. So that might be right at the panel, or it might be the inverter if it's a string inverter system.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
but that's an important thing to remember as we size that wire, because if you forget that, you're going to be undersizing your wire.
Okay.
Okie doke. All right. Well, then if there are no additional questions, we'll put it off till next week. But during the week, if you do have questions, send me an email. Send me a question. I think Craig, was it you who was sending through questions about solar generators and stuff during the week, or was that someone else?
No, that wasn't me.
Okay. So, all right.
No. Thank you, though.
Well, I answered them, so it wasn't you, but you can be rest assured they have been answered. All right. Well, we'll see you guys next week. All right.
All right. Have a great week. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.